Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this review is all about the video quality of the Fujifilm X-H2, a high-end mirrorless camera with a 40 megapixel APS-C sensor and 8K video that costs around $2,000 or £1,900. If you're interested in the photo capabilities of this camera, do check out my separate review of that, linked here. Both my movie and photo reviews were made with a final production X-H2, and I'm going to dive straight into my results as I've already covered the physical design and the control system in my earlier first looks video. So if you'd like a refresher on the look and feel of the camera, do check out that one. Before kicking off though, a quick reminder that the X-H2 is one of two flagship cameras announced by Fujifilm in 2022, both sharing the exact same body but with different and new sensors. The X-H2S arrived in May with a 26 megapixel stack sensor designed for speed, while the X-H2 followed in September with a 40 megapixel sensor designed for high resolution. Now 40 megapixels makes it the highest resolution APS-C sensor in a mainstream camera to date, and crucially for videographers allows it to film 8K without scaling. Indeed, it's one of the most affordable 8K cameras with a decent sized sensor and interchangeable lenses to date. It's also of particular interest to Fuji fans since it will almost certainly end up in a future X-T5, X Pro 4 and other models too. Interestingly, the more complex design of the stack sensor in the earlier X-H2S version makes it more expensive than the X-H2, with that particular model costing $2,500 or pounds. So the big question is not only how well the X-H2 performs for video, but is it a better choice than the S version? How clean cut is that? Let's find out. I'll start with movie resolution, with the X-H2 offering 1080, 4K, 6.2K and 8K resolutions, the latter a first on a mainstream APS-C camera. All are recorded uncropped at 24 to 30p. 1080 and 4K are also available at 50 and 60p, albeit now incurring a 1.14 times crop. Yep, even for 1080. 1080 and 4K are additionally available in the choice of 16:9 or the slightly wider DCI shapes, although 6.2 and 8K are in 16:9 only. Unlike the X-H2S, there's no open gate option which records the full sensor area, although as I'll show you later on, you can still make a variety of high-res reformats from 8K footage. There's also a 4K HQ mode which oversamples from 8K's worth of data for potentially crisper results, albeit limited to 24 to 30p. If you're into slow motion, the high-speed recording menu allows you to film 1080 at 100 to 240p, although all of those frame rates incur a 1.23 times crop. Like the X-H2S, high-speed footage does support autofocus, but doesn't include sound and is also automatically encoded in slow motion at a user-selected frame rate. For example, 1080 100p can be encoded at 25 or 50p for a 4 or 2 times slowdown, while 1080 240p can be encoded in either 24, 30 or 60p for a 10, 8 or 4 times slowdown. Unlike the X-H2S, there is no 4K above 60p. So already there's some key differences between the two models for videographers to weigh up. The X-H2S supports 4K 120, albeit with a 1.29 times crop, open gate 6.2K, uncropped 1080 up to 120p, and uncropped 4K up to 60p. But the X-H2 counters with support for 8K and of course a lower price tag too. Now there's also rolling shutter differences that I'll mention in a moment. Like the X-H2S, a highlight of the camera is being able to record any resolution internally using ProRes LT, 422 or HQ, although the high bit rates do demand a CF Express card. If you prefer to film at more modest bit rates, you can encode 1080 to 8K in H.265 or opt for old-fashioned H.264 for 1080 or 4K only. Now all of these, including 8K, can be recorded onto SD cards. There's no internal RAW for video, but the X-H2 will output RAW video over its full-size HDMI port in 8K up to 30p in the 16:9 shape. You can also choose between Atmos and Blackmagic formats, although at the time of testing I didn't have a supported recorder to try either out. Also inherited from the X-H2S is unlimited internal recording, sailing past the previous half-hour limit and also without overheating issues, at least in my own tests. Now I made 5 separate recordings, each starting with a full battery, and was able to record between 100 and 120 minutes in any format from 1080 to 8K before the battery expired. Now all my tests were made at room temperature in the UK, which isn't exactly hot, but if you're filming under hotter conditions and experiencing overheating, you can extend the recording times by fitting an optional fan accessory, as seen here on the S version. This simply screws into the back of the body when the screen's folded out. It's not particularly elegant, but it will extend your recording times. Okay, so now let's compare the different quality settings in practice. And I've filmed all of these clips using the new XF56 1.2 WR, which is one of the sharpest lenses in the system. I'm going to quickly run through them showing the full view before taking a closer look. So first, here's 1080p, followed by standard 4K, before switching to 4K HQ, and now 6.2K, and finally 8K. Although remember, this project was edited in 4K, so to see any difference we'll of course need to zoom in. So let's return to the 1080 clip and zoom into a portion for closer examination. All of these clips were filmed in the standard ProView simulation and at 25p, so they're all uncropped. Next for 4K at 25p, where you'll notice a step up in detail if you're streaming this in 4K and viewing it on a high-res display. Note that if you increase the frame rate to 50p for 1080 or 4K, you'll incur a 1.14 times crop. Now for 4K HQ mode, which oversamples from 8K and therefore is only available at the same frame rates up to 30p. Look closely and it is a little bit crisper, but since the standard 4K is already pretty good, the difference isn't as great as the two 4K modes on the Canon EOS R5. Next for 6.2K at 25p, again only available up to 30p on the X-H2 and only in the 16:9 format. Remember, 6.2K on the previous X-H2S version was an open gate mode employing the full 3x2 shaped frame. And finally here for 8K at 25p, which like 6.2K is only available up to 30p and in 16:9. All these clips were recorded using H.265 10-bit 422. Now let's see how the X-H2 compares to the X-H2S for video resolution, starting with 1080 video, and I've stuck with the same magnified view as before, but this time you have the X-H2 on the left and the X-H2S on the right, both looking fairly similar at this resolution. Note that the X-H2 will crop beyond 30p though, whereas the S is uncropped for 1080 up to 120p. Next here's 4K with the X-H2 in standard mode on the left and the X-H2S on the right. And the S is looking a bit crisper here, although if you carefully boost the sharpening and contrast you can get the X-H2 looking close. And now I've switched standard 4K from the X-H2 on the left for its 4K HQ mode, which oversamples from 8K's worth of detail, while leaving the X-H2S 4K unchanged on the right because it's only got one option. It's a little crisper than the non-HQ version, but the S version on the right still looks a little more contrasty here, perhaps due to a difference in processing. Okay, now for a 6.2K comparison with the X-H2 on the left and the S on the right, although note the original aspect ratios are different, 16:9 and 3:2 respectively, so the S version is cropped and a little lower resolution in the same area. Both do look better than their respective 4K versions, but the X-H2 on the left understandably enjoys a very small edge here. And finally, I'll switch the X-H2 sample on the left to 8K and leave the S version at its maximum 6.2 on the right. It's subtle on this particular subject, but I'd say the X-H2's 8K on the left is genuinely capturing more real-life detail, but whether that's a deal breaker for the S is really down to you. The 6.2K mode on the S version can certainly look very good, while also giving you the flexibility of a taller frame to make crops from. Let's now move on to a more formal comparison using my resolution chart, and here I've switched the XF50 to 140 zoom roughly midway through its range. Taking a closer look with the X-H2 on the left and the X-H2S on the right, starting with 1080 at 25p, where they look pretty similar. Next for 1080 at 50p, where the X-H2 crops a little, so I've had to adjust the zoom to match, but the end result still remains similar. At 1080 100p though, the X-H2S on the right is doing a better job, while also remaining uncropped. But at 1080 200p, the S takes a big hit, with the plain X-H2 taking a small lead. Next for 4K, where I've moved to a different portion of the chart to show the limiting resolution, starting with standard 4K 25p from the X-H2 on the left, and 4K 25p from the X-H2S on the right. The S looks a tad crisper here, but the resolution is similar. Switching the X-H2 on the left for the HQ version brings a mild improvement, but it's not huge. At 4K 50p, the X-H2 incurs a crop, so I've adjusted the zoom to match the coverage. It looks a little softer than the oversampled 4K 25 version, but is roughly similar to the S on the right. And for good measure, I'll swap the S image for 4K at 100p, which may incur a crop, but that's unavailable on the plain X-H2. And finally, the high resolution modes, starting with 6.2K on both cameras, although as noted earlier, the S version on the right is an open gate frame that's taller, so it isn't concentrating all its pixels into the 16:9 target. They're both delivering a great result here though, out-resolving the 4K samples. And lastly, swapping the X-H2 result on the left for the one that I filmed in 8K, which I'd say isn't making a huge difference with this subject and this particular lens, proving that you really do need the sharpest lenses if you want to see a more significant benefit at the highest resolutions, whether you're filming video or shooting photos. Now you may be wondering why you want or even need 8K given the lack of 8K displays, but not only does it allow the X-H2 to generate oversampled 4K, which can look better than the normal mode, it also lets you crop and reframe footage and still be left with a good looking result. Now there's nothing stopping you from filming in 8K and doing this zoom and reframing in post, but a new digital zoom function exploits 8K capabilities to deliver 4K footage with an optional 2x zoom as you record. You can see it in action here, turning my 35mm f2 prime into a 2x zoom, and the results look pretty good in 4K. The actual zooming itself is also sufficiently smooth that you can use it while filming too. It's also available for 1080 recording, although strangely still limited to the same 2x range, and that's strange because there's surely enough pixels to stretch it to a 4x zoom in this format. Moving on, here's a quick comparison of noise levels at 3200 ISO, starting here with the X-H2 in its 4K HQ mode, before taking a closer look with the X-H2 on the left and the X-H2S on the right, the latter filming in its only 4K mode. Both were using the exact same exposure here. And for fun, I'll now swap out the 4K HQ version on the left for 8K on the X-H2, still with the same exposure settings at 3200 ISO. If you're into grading, the X-H2 offers F-Log at a base of 500 ISO, and the new F-Log 2 at a base of 1000 ISO and claiming over 12 and 13 stops of dynamic range respectively. The earlier X-H2S claims 1 stop more in either case, but operates at higher bases of 640 and 1250 ISO. To make the most of the extended dynamic range on either camera, you can film in 10-bit 422, although do beware that F-Log 2 may suffer from worse rolling shutter. Here's a quick look at the potential for adjusting the dynamic range on a wider DR project in Final Cut, although do note that since the screen recording and the presentation here on YouTube is in 8-bit, you should use the waveform monitor as an indication of the potential. I've also provided a sample clip for you to try grading yourself via my review at cameralabs.com if you're interested. Moving on, the X-H2 shares the same revamped autofocus system as the S model, with the new X Processor 5 behind the scenes now supporting 6 subject detection options, which can recognise and track animals, birds, cars, bikes, aeroplanes and trains, along with a separate menu for the more traditional human face and eye detection. Shouldn't they all be together? Let's start with a basic single AF area in the middle of the frame though, and see how well the X-H2 can simply rack focus. First, when fitted with the XF35 F2 at f2, where you can see the hesitation midway that I've noticed on previous models in my tests. It's not just on this lens either, as here's the 50-140 at 142.8 showing the same hesitation as it racks from one subject to the other. On the upside, the camera does at least remain on the subject without visible wobbling, but it would have been nice to have a single complete rack between one and the other subject. Here's another quick test with the 35 F2 again, where the tripod is fixed and I'm using the touchscreen to select the subject. Again, there's the same racking issue with the minor hesitation, but at least there's no wobbling once it gets there. But how would this translate into a real life situation? Here's one of my typical review introductions filmed with the X-H2, and this time with the old 10-24 f4 and a single AF area, repositioning the subject for various close-ups and details. Now, if you've seen any of my earlier reviews, you'll be very familiar with the output from the Sony a6400 and 24-1.8 lens that I normally use for my product tours, and while I'm very fond of that combination, I'd say the X-H2 is at least matching it here. Okay, how about face tracking on the X-H2? Here filmed outdoors with a 50-140 at 50mm 2.8, with the camera successfully keeping me focused as I move around the frame. I used face and eye detection here. But I also wanted to see how well the X-H2 handled filming more typical pieces to camera where the presenter would normally stay at a fixed distance. So here I am at various distances indoors with the XF35 F2, and as I keep still, watch those bokeh blobs in the background for any telltale pulsing. I'd say they're behaving fairly well here. So one more try with a 50-140 at 52.8 and again at different distances, and again those bokeh blobs in the background are staying fairly well behaved with little to no change in their size. So a pretty good result here for the X-H2. But what the X-H2 sports over the previous generation are those new subject detection modes. So here's Steven Seagal on the Brighton seafront using the 50-140 at 140mm 2.8 and with bird detection mode of course. While composing, you can see the small AF box over the bird's eye, and that allows you to reframe and not worry about the focus. And now switching to 4K 50p, where the crop on the X-H2 has actually allowed a little extra reach, which is handy for wildlife, plus of course the chance to slow down by 2 times if desired. And now here's some examples of birds in flight, filmed in 1080 at 200p, where the footage is automatically slowed by 8 times on my 25p timeline. As noted earlier, there is a crop when using high-speed video on the X-H2 at any frame rate, and while there is support for autofocus, it didn't feel quite as confident with the birds here as it did when I was testing the earlier X-H2S. Plus, the S model also has the benefit of 4K at 120 for better looking slow motion. But if the motion isn't too quick or erratic, you can still grab a successful clip like the one here. If your subject is static though, no problem. Here's the X-H2 filming my splash test in 4K 50p, first playing back at normal speed before switching to a version slowed by 2 times on my 25p timeline. And next for a version filmed in 1080 at 100p, which is automatically slowed by 4 times. And finally one at 1080 200p, which is slowed by 8 times. Now there is a hit on resolution, not to mention a crop in all of the high speed modes, but they may be good enough for your needs. Oh, and if you are manually focusing on the X-H2, it actually includes a neat metering option. This uses a metronome style graphic which swings back and forth to indicate which direction you need to focus in and how far you need to go before turning green to indicate that you've nailed it. Thankfully this also works while you're recording. Now for a quick rolling shutter test, here starting with the X-H2 in standard 4K mode, which exhibits greater skewing than the S version as expected, albeit a little bit better than the previous X-T4 generation. We use any of the top 3 modes, so that's 4K HQ, 6.2K or 8K, and beware that the rolling shutter will become much more obvious due to the slower readout and end up looking a little bit worse than the X-T4. Indeed, videographers who can't avoid fast pans or subjects should rule out the X-H2 in this respect, and they'll probably much prefer the quicker readout of the X-H2S version. Finally, one of the other benefits of the earlier X-H2S is a true open gate mode that records the entire frame in the 3x2 shape, giving you greater height than traditional 16:9 footage and more flexibility in cropping, especially when making vertical videos. Here's an example I made using the 6.2K open gate mode on the X-H2S, which illustrates 2 different crops. But you may be able to do something roughly similar by exploiting the high resolution of the X-H2 video by filming 8K with a really wide lens, such as this clip with the 10-24. Here's 2 different crops that I've made in the 16:9 shape, one landscape and the other one portrait, but both sporting 4K resolution after the crop. Ultimately, I'd still have preferred a true open gate mode in the taller 3x2 shape, but that would have been a lot of data to handle and probably beyond the processor. And now it's time for my final verdict. For videographers, it's easy to assume the X-H2 is going to be outshone by the S version with its stacked sensor. After all, that model not only enjoys noticeably reduced rolling shutter, making it much more practical for fast subjects and pans, but it also includes 4K at 120p and a true open gate mode that records the full sensor area for more cropping flexibility. But the X-H2 responds with 8K recording and a $500 cheaper price tag, not to mention the benefit of a little extra firmware development time, giving it a handy manual focus meter and more accurate auto white balance. The inclusion of 8K video though is key, as the X-H2 actually becomes one of the most affordable cameras with the capability, at least with a decent sized sensor and interchangeable lenses. Plus there were no overheating issues in my own tests either. Take that, Canon EOS R5. That said, 6.2K on the X-H2S version comes very close in quality, which coupled with 4K 120 and the reduced rolling shutter makes it preferable overall for video, and in my opinion worth spending the extra if you are filming. If you're solely focused on video, be sure to also compare the Lumix G8.6, and if you don't need the highest resolution, there's a number of solid full frame options at around the same price tag. Ultimately, the X-H2 is designed as a high-resolution camera, successfully pushing the pixel count for still photos in the APS-C format to a point where 8K video could also be captured. The S version may be arguably more attractive overall for video, but couple that 8K capability with the shared benefits of respectable autofocus, internal ProRes, a great viewfinder, full-size HDMI, good-looking footage out of camera and plenty of dynamic range in F-Log 2, and the X-H2 does become a highly compelling video camera for $2,000. I suspect many owners will buy it for the photo resolution first, before quickly realising that they're also getting a great quality video camera too. And that's it for this video focused review of the X-H2, but this is only one half of the story, so please do check out my other part, which is all about the photo quality, and I've linked to that here. In the meantime, I'd love to hear what you think, especially regarding the decision between a high-end APS-C camera versus a budget to mid-range full-framer. Thanks for watching, and if you like what I do, please do consider subscribing or shouting me a coffee. There's links in the description. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.